Hey guys, tonight we slip into something far less glamorous than golden thrones or sweeping coronation processions. Instead, we're sneaking behind the velvet curtains of royal history to discover the most embarrassing, awkward, and downright bizarre ways monarchs have exited the stage. Imagine the pomp, the power, the absolutely avoidable pratfalls that led kings and queens to their unceremonious ends. You probably won't survive some of these, no matter how many royal guards you summon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments. Always curious where you're tuning in from as we travel through these cringeworthy moments of history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dim corridors of history, feet echoing on the cold stone, the faint scent of aged parchment mixing with your restless thoughts. Somewhere in England in the 18th century, King George II stands alone in his chamber, dressed in full regalia. He's supposed to be the embodiment of dignity, robes of deep velvet, powdered wig perfectly in place, and a crown that might as well be made of pure arrogance. But then, just as the court waits in hushed reverence, the king, perhaps distracted by some royal spreadsheet of taxes or another tedious political pamphlet, suffers a rather embarrassing mishap. In an unexpected and tragically literal twist, he collapses from a sudden heart attack and falls awkwardly, his breeches having been hastily fastened that morning. Some court whispers later, and historians still argue whether this fall was purely coincidental or partly responsible for his ignominious end. The fact that a king, expected to reign with an aura of invincibility, could be felled not by enemies, rebellion, or political upheaval, but by the betrayals of his own body and possibly a fashion faux pas, is a sharp reminder that no amount of pomp protects you from mortality's uninvited punch. Now King George II's death isn't just a footnote for comedians and sleepy historians. It's the perfect introduction to a recurring theme in royal history, the disconnect between the grandeur of authority and the sheer absurdity of human frailty. You might imagine a royal passing as a scene draped in solemnity, orchestral strings rising as nobles wipe away polite tears. But more often than not, there's an embarrassing thud, a misplaced jest, or an unfortunate wardrobe malfunction. It's the ultimate reality check, a reminder that power and dignity do not always walk hand in hand. For example, did you know that the precise cause of George II's collapse remains debated by scholars? Some suggest it was a natural heart failure, while others point to that awkward stumble as being emblematic of a monarch out of touch with the physical demands of leadership. The quirk of history is that no matter the interpretation, the outcome remains the same. George II did not survive this particular misadventure. You shift your attention, almost feeling the air grow heavier as if the ghosts of royal mishaps are gathering to whisper. Next in line is Emperor Claudius of Rome, whose death story is almost too strange to be real. Poisoned mushrooms, yes, actual fungi, allegedly served at a banquet by his own wife Agrippina. Historians still argue whether it was intentional murder or tragic coincidence. But what's more fascinating is the fringe theory suggesting Claudius's death wasn't a calculated political move, but simply the result of terrible culinary choices. Picture a Roman chef, sweating under the pressure of imperial expectations, accidentally lacing a mushroom risotto with deadly amanita, the kind of fatal error you hope never happens in your own kitchen. It's easy to scoff, to imagine that only royalty could experience such comical tragedy, but in truth, these events humanize the high and mighty. Think of it, centuries of tradition, bloodlines, and sacred oaths, all undone by the unpredictable whim of digestive misfortune. And speaking of digestive misfortune, let's not forget the curious case of Pharaoh Ramses II's descendant, his great-grandson, whose untimely death is shrouded in mystery and legend. One particularly bizarre account claims that he was fatally afflicted by his own use of crocodile dung sunscreen. Yes, crocodile dung, a substance that seems more suited for a questionable biology experiment than royal skincare. Ancient Egyptians were nothing if not experimental when it came to beauty regimens, and this tale stands as one of the stranger entries in the annals of personal hygiene. Whether this tale holds any truth remains subject to heated scholarly debate. Some experts dismiss it as a later invention designed to mock the eccentricity of ancient rulers, while others suggest it may have a kernel of truth wrapped in sensationalism. Either way, it serves as a stark reminder that royal deaths weren't always matters of noble sacrifice or political drama. Sometimes, they were simply the result of trying too hard. As you settle further into this soft descent through time, you realize that the irony is not lost. The same leaders who wielded empires and commanded armies often met their end through the most mundane of circumstances. No conspiracy, no grand betrayal, just poor timing, bad health, and occasionally literal bad luck. And so, the pattern begins. The disconnect between expectation and reality, between imperial image and human flaw, slowly unravels before you. The grand tapestry of history, it seems, is woven not just with battles and treaties, but with embarrassing exits, awkward accidents, and quiet, almost absurd Your journey drifts onward, the ancient corridors growing quieter now, the soft echo of your footsteps mingling with the faint hum of history's most awkward whispers. You find yourself stepping into the shadowed halls of Rome, where power wore a laurel crown and decadence seeped from every marble pillar. The scene is set, the imperial palace adorned with gold mosaics, frescoes of conquered peoples, and the ever-present air of political intrigue. Here Emperor Claudius sits, an unlikely ruler. Unlike the imposing statues of Augustus or Nero's flamboyance, Claudius is often remembered as a stammering, slightly bumbling figure. But don't let appearances fool you, he was an effective administrator. In fact, Claudius expanded the Roman Empire considerably, annexing Britannia in 43 AD, a feat that scholars agree was no small task and still shapes debates about Roman imperial strategy. But today, we're not concerned with conquests or statecraft. Instead, your eyes settle on the fateful banquet. A lavish affair, extravagant even by Roman standards, overflowing with exotic delicacies, roasted peacock, dormice stuffed with nuts, and more importantly, an assortment of mushrooms, some carefully cultivated, others possibly foraged from less reputable sources. The story goes that Agrippina, Claudius's scheming wife, perhaps eyeing power for her son Nero, had set the table with an especially potent dish of fungi. You might picture Agrippina sitting at the head of the table, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as Claudius digs into the mushroom platter. The taste is described in ancient texts as earthy, rich, and delicious, a perfect distraction from the political tensions simmering beneath the surface. But what happens next is far less appetizing. Claudius collapses, apparently without warning. His face turns pale, his speech slurs even further, and then silence. The Roman court, ever dramatic, descends into panic. Some suggest he was poisoned, an allegation historians still fiercely debate. Others propose he merely succumbed to natural causes, exacerbated by poor digestion or a bad batch of mushrooms. Fringe theory even posits that Claudius had a pre-existing medical condition, possibly porphyria, making him vulnerable to toxins. What's striking is how history records this event, not with the gravitas of a noble death in service to the empire, but as a cautionary tale of personal vulnerability. Imagine the irony, a man who expanded the boundaries of the empire, securing wealth and stability, undone by a humble fungus. This isn't the only time an emperor's end seems more slapstick than stately. Recall that peculiar detail about Emperor Elagabalus, whose pet menagerie allegedly included lions, bears, and ostriches roaming freely through palace halls. Some historians argue this was political posturing, others suggest sheer eccentricity. But perhaps in the end, his downfall was as much about public revulsion at his antics as political scheming. Claudius's death opened the gates for Nero's rise, a moment equally drenched in scandal. The young Nero, infamous for fiddling while Rome burned, a detail still debated by historians, would go on to cement his own place in history, though never as subtly as his predecessor's demise. Shifting focus back, your footsteps carry you to the tale of Pharaoh Ramses II's descendant. Ancient Egypt, a land of ritual, eternal monuments, and surprisingly inventive beauty regimens. The story of crocodile dung sunscreen is one of those delightful historical curiosities that make you wonder if history's greatest leaders secretly moonlighted as experimental chemists. The account, first noted by Roman historians, claims that this particular pharaoh's fatal mistake was applying a concoction of crocodile dung mixed with resin to his skin under the blazing Egyptian sun. The purpose was twofold: to protect from sunburn and to ward off insects. But somewhere along the way, the formula backfired. Historians are still divided. Some suggest the dung contained harmful bacteria that led to a systemic infection. Others argue that the story was exaggerated by later Roman writers eager to mock Egyptian practices as primitive. Either way, the image lingers: a monarch dressed in linen and gold, slathering himself in what modern sensibilities would call a biohazard, unaware that this supposed protection would become his undoing. It's not just about death, you realize, but about hubris. The attempt to control nature's unpredictability only to fall victim to it. This theme hums like a soft background noise as you continue, the notion that power often blinds rulers to their own fragility. It's almost poetic if it weren't so tragic. As you pause for a moment, you think about the grand ironies of history. A man who should symbolize strength undone by fungi. A monarch attempting to shield his skin with crocodile excrement, only to be undone by it. Claudius, Ramses II's descendant, and so many others aren't anomalies. They are reminders that history, for all its grandeur, loves the absurd. Your mind drifts further down this sleepy path, ready for the next tale of royal indignity. But for now, the echo of Claudius's last breath and the pharaoh's fatal sunscreen blend into the soft hum around you, a whisper that even kings and emperors cannot escape their own human folly. You keep walking, your steps slower now, the air seeming to thicken with the weight of ancient misfortune. The soft glow of candlelight flickers against the worn walls, and somewhere far off, the faint sound of a lute plays a melancholy tune, echoing through the palace corridors of time. This next story drifts from Rome and Egypt to the sands and stone of medieval Egypt, where the line between regal splendor and absurd tragedy blurs once more. Pharaoh Ramses II's great-grandson didn't simply fade away into obscurity. His death, wrapped in the odd legacy of experimental beauty care, is only part of a wider pattern that sees rulers failing in the most embarrassing ways. But you're about to meet a case that takes bizarre to a whole new level. It's the reign of King John of England, infamous in history not for heroic deeds, but for a litany of political blunders, failed wars, and what many scholars argue was the worst temperament any monarch should have. You might already know him from the tales of Robin Hood and the Magna Carta, but what rarely gets highlighted is his rather unceremonious demise. One fateful day, as the story goes, King John was traversing the muddy wilderness of eastern England, somewhere near Newark. He was ill, already battling a fever that gnawed at his strength. The chronicles tell us of his poor diet, his physical unfitness, and most intriguingly, a penchant for bad apples, quite literally. Scholars still debate whether his final illness was dysentery, poisoning, or simply poor health exacerbated by malnutrition and stress. You can almost see it now. The ill-tempered monarch trudging through rain-slicked fields, his royal cloak dragging in the mud, muttering complaints about bad governance, treacherous nobles, and the wretched state of his stomach. His condition worsens until he finally collapses, succumbing not with a grand flourish but with the quiet indignity of a man felled by his own digestive system. Here's a fun, if unsettling, tidbit. There's a fringe theory that suggests John's death was not entirely natural. Some speculate he was deliberately poisoned by disgruntled barons or even by his own advisors, tired of his inept rule. Others maintain he simply overindulged in improperly preserved fruit, which led to a fatal bout of food poisoning. Scholars still argue over this to this day, dissecting medieval texts as if they were cryptic medical records, trying to parse meaning from vague Latin phrases and biased chroniclers. But the public memory of King John doesn't focus on political intrigue or mysterious poisonings. Instead, he is remembered as the king who, legend claims, lost his crown to a combination of bad health, bad decisions, and an even worse digestive system. The image of a bloated, disgruntled monarch curling up in misery is almost too absurd to be real, yet it's precisely this absurdity that etches his death into history. Moving along the timeline, your senses adjust as you approach another curious royal misadventure, one of public humiliation that did not end in death, but certainly in disgrace. Let's talk about King Charles I of England, whose execution is more often depicted as a solemn affair of justice than the bizarre spectacle it arguably became. Charles I was no stranger to controversy. His stubborn insistence on absolute monarchy, ignoring the Parliament's growing power, led to the English Civil War. But when his reign crumbled and he was sentenced to death, you might expect the scene to be solemn, filled with dignity and reflection. Instead, reports suggest a rather awkward final moment. As the executioner's axe hovered over his head, Charles reportedly blurted out a line about having but one life to give for his kingdom, a somewhat defiant and rehearsed phrase. But one curious bystander noted that the king seemed more flustered than courageous, fumbling with his collar and nearly losing his footing. Some historians still argue whether these were genuine expressions of dignity or the visible discomfort of a man caught in an utterly humiliating predicament. Even the execution itself became part of the royal comedy of errors. The axe was said to have required more than one swing, a mistake that would make any butcher cringe. The fact that a king's final moment was marked by such an inelegant display only feeds the narrative that sometimes historical grandeur is a thin veil for personal inadequacy. And what about the strange interplay of fate and folly that follows in these tales? Consider Emperor Elagabalus, whose penchant for scandal is legendary. His palace reportedly housed exotic pets, lions, tigers, bears, and yes, even ostriches allowed to roam freely. Elagabalus allegedly invited guests to elaborate banquets where the animals mingled with attendees, creating scenes of chaos and horror. Scholars still debate whether this was sheer eccentricity or a political statement, a demonstration of imperial power over nature itself. But the fringe argument, whispered in the corridors of fringe historians, suggests that Elagabalus's penchant for the absurd ultimately led to his downfall. He was murdered by the Praetorian Guard after a reign of barely 3 years, the victim of a palace coup that some say was less about politics and more about public disgust at his antics. You can't help but chuckle softly at the recurring theme: rulers attempting to assert their dominion over nature only to be undone by their hubris. Whether it's poisonous mushrooms, ill-chosen sunscreens, bad apples, botched executions, or free-roaming wildlife, the lesson seems clear. History isn't always written in blood and glory. Sometimes it's written in folly. Your path meanders further, the atmosphere growing softer, almost hypnotic, as if the very walls of history are settling into a slow, knowing sigh. The flicker of torchlight dances faintly on crumbling stone, blending shadows of forgotten kings and queens with the gentle hum of inevitability. Ahead lays a tale soaked in politics, power struggles, and the peculiar intersection of justice and absurdity, the execution of King Charles I of England. You don't need a dramatic drumroll to understand the gravity of the moment. The year is 1649 and England is caught in the throes of civil war. Parliament has risen against the king, and after a lengthy trial that would still be studied by legal scholars today for its controversial precedent, Charles I is sentenced to death. The official charge: high treason against the people of England. But the narrative that followed his final moments was anything but dignified. As the morning of January 30th dawned, Charles emerged from his chambers, not with the regal stride one might expect from a sovereign monarch, but with the awkward gait of a man both resolute and undeniably flustered. You can almost see it. His crown absent, powdered wig askew, his doublet poorly buttoned. Court witnesses recall his hands trembling not from fear or courage, but from the sheer physical weight of the moment. He stepped onto the scaffold, which had been hastily constructed in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. The cold air of London nipped at his skin, a bitter reminder that this was no ceremony of honor but an execution. The axe gleamed in the pale winter light, an object far too mundane to fit the stage of royal downfall. Charles made a speech, as expected of a king, a defiant declaration that he governed by divine right, that his sovereignty was not subject to earthly courts. But then came the awkwardness. Contemporary accounts describe him fumbling with his collar, struggling to find the precise position, pausing far too long before resigning himself to the inevitable. Some onlookers chuckled, others wept. Historians still argue whether this hesitation was a sign of humility, madness, or simply human error. When the executioner's blade finally fell, the first strike failed to sever his head cleanly. Yes, the axe required a second swing. A pause, a moment of dreadful absurdity, as though the universe itself were struggling to accommodate the death of a king in the most undignified way possible. This moment, so awkward, so imperfect, became a defining chapter in the ongoing debate over monarchy and power. Was Charles a martyr, a tragic figure upholding divine rights against the tide of parliamentary rule, or was he a bumbling tyrant who brought his downfall upon himself through incompetence and cruelty? Scholars have argued this point for centuries, parsing trial transcripts, personal letters, and eyewitness accounts, each offering slightly different versions of a scene that could have come straight from a Shakespearean farce. But kings weren't the only ones to meet ignoble ends. The quirk of royal demise seemed to touch nobles and emperors alike, seeping into their narratives like a bad joke they couldn't escape. Consider the curious downfall of Louis XVI of France, the last king before the French Revolution erupted into violent fervor. His life had been one of privilege and ceremony, of opulent banquets and powdered wigs, of Versailles' endless mirrors reflecting the self-importance of an absolute monarchy. And yet, as the revolution tightened its grip, the lavish lifestyle that once seemed so invincible turned into a cruel irony. The day came when Louis XVI was stripped of his crown and dignity, paraded before an increasingly hostile public. The image of the fat king, overweight and listless, was used in revolutionary propaganda to mock his indulgence and detachment from his suffering subjects. While some historians argue that his death was a necessary step toward modern democracy, others still contend it was a tragic misinterpretation of a monarch striving to adapt too slowly to changing times. Louis's final days were marked by a peculiar mix of stubbornness and resignation. He reportedly spent hours attempting to write a coherent last message to his family, only to crumple sheet after sheet in frustration. And as the guillotine blade fell, there was no orchestral swell, no noble farewell, just the cold finality of an executioner's swing. What fascinates you most is the recurring pattern. Each monarch seems to be undone by some trivial, almost absurd personal failing rather than a grand political coup. The details blur: bad mushrooms, bad apples, ill-fitting collars, experimental sunscreen, and strangely liberated wildlife roaming palace halls. These are the human errors that history has preserved with a touch of sardonic glee. And so, as you feel yourself drifting further into this narrative, you realize that the grand arcs of history, The rise and fall of empires, the battles fought over borders, the treaties signed in gilded halls are often punctuated by the smallest of mishaps. The slip of a hand, the misjudged ingredient, the hesitation of a collar clasp. The irony hangs in the air, thick as the incense once burned in royal chapels. No matter the wealth, no matter the power, no matter the divine right claimed by kings and emperors, they are, in the end, remarkably prone to the same embarrassing human follies that the faint creak of ancient wood beneath your feet guides you onward, deeper into the slow unraveling of history's most humiliating exits. The atmosphere grows softer, more intimate, as if the very air conspires to lull you into acceptance of history's most uncomfortable truths. You're no longer just an observer, you're part of the narrative, slowly understanding that the tapestry of royalty is embroidered not only with victories and legacies, but with blunders and embarrassments. Your next stop is the curious story of Emperor Elagabalus, whose reign is as scandalous as it is short-lived. It was 218 AD, and the Roman Empire was already teetering under layers of political instability. Elagabalus, at just 14 years old, was elevated to emperor, largely because of his mother's influence. The young ruler, however, quickly became infamous, not for military prowess or administrative reforms, but for a series of bizarre decisions that scandalized the Roman elite. First, there were the pets. The story goes that Elagabalus kept a menagerie of wild animals in the palace: lions, leopards, ostriches, and even bears. Not content with confining them to private chambers, he allegedly allowed them to roam freely during lavish banquets, much to the horror and amusement of his guests. Imagine the scene: senators trying to debate matters of state while a lion lounges lazily between platters of exotic game. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's eccentric pet policy was sheer madness, political posturing, or an extreme form of performance art meant to display dominance over nature and court politics alike. Some suggest it was an attempt to parody the pomp of Roman tradition, mocking the very ceremonies that had upheld the empire's power for centuries. Fringe scholars, ever eager for sensationalism, claim that the young emperor saw himself as a living god, transcending the mundane by surrounding himself with untamed beasts. But this was only the beginning of his downfall. Elagabalus is also remembered for his unconventional religious practices, particularly his fervent promotion of the Eastern sun god, Elagabal, a deity practically unknown in Roman religious tradition. His insistence on replacing Jupiter with this foreign idol, forcing senators and priests to worship it, sparked outrage. It was a cultural scandal, as if someone walked into your local place of worship and declared, "From now on, we're all switching to dragon worship." Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, long tired of his erratic behavior and public mockery of tradition, orchestrated his assassination. His rule lasted merely 3 years, ending not in grand battle or noble sacrifice, but in a conspiracy born from sheer exasperation. His death was swift, almost anticlimactic, a brutal stabbing in the palace, surrounded by a chorus of disapproving whispers rather than the tragic fanfare one might expect. As you reflect, the pattern emerges ever more clearly. Royal power is not immune to human folly. You've seen how George II's wardrobe malfunction, Claudius's toxic banquet, and Ramses II's descendant's sunscreen disaster all led to ignominious ends. Elagabalus's death fits this tapestry perfectly, a young ruler undone not by rebellion but by his own over-the-top eccentricities. Next, your mind drifts to a lesser-known but equally bizarre royal demise, the strange tale of King Ferdinand I of Naples, who ruled in the early 16th century. Ferdinand's downfall doesn't involve poison, public execution, or wild animals, but rather a peculiar case of digestive misadventure. Reports from the time claim that Ferdinand suffered from severe digestive problems throughout his reign, often attributed to an overly indulgent diet and poor medical advice. In a peculiar twist of fate, rumors circulated that he met his end after consuming a plate of improperly prepared legumes, leading to a fatal intestinal obstruction. The fringe theory suggests that Ferdinand's court physicians, renowned for their incompetence, may have intentionally worsened his condition, either out of malice or sheer ineptitude. Some modern scholars argue that this case was less about intentional harm and more about the disastrous state of Renaissance medicine, where the line between treatment and poison was dangerously thin. What makes Ferdinand's death particularly interesting is how little it resembles the dramatic falls of other monarchs. There were no conspiracies, no grand public spectacle, just the quiet collapse of a ruler undone by his own appetite, an unremarkable yet deeply humiliating demise. It's a far cry from the epic narratives of kings dying on the battlefield or defending their realms. Instead, it's a whisper of human vulnerability, a reminder that the most powerful figures are not immune to the trivial disasters that plague us all: poor digestion, ill-advised meals, or incompetent medical advice. Even more fascinating is the contrast between public perception and historical interpretation. Ferdinand is scarcely remembered for his reign, but is occasionally cited in medical histories as a cautionary example of Renaissance-era treatment gone horribly wrong. You can almost hear the sigh of historians still arguing whether his death was the result of gross negligence or simply bad luck. As you continue down this slow, sleepy trail, the realization settles in: history doesn't always glorify its great figures. More often than not, it delights in revealing their most embarrassing, petty, and human failures. Kings and emperors who once held the fate of nations in their hands are remembered not for their triumphs but for the strange accidents that led to their final exit. Your footsteps slow as you prepare for the next peculiar episode, a narrative of scandal, excess, and a regicide that defies The air grows denser as you trudge deeper into history's quieter, more humiliating corners. The faint glow of candlelight dims further, the only sound now your own steady breath and the subtle creak of ancient timber beneath your feet. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper of scandal and betrayal seems to drift from the walls themselves, pulling you toward the next chapter, a tale where animals, eccentricity, and political folly collide into an unforgettable royal demise. Your mind shifts to Emperor Elagabalus once again, a figure whose bizarre reign has often been dismissed as little more than a historical footnote, a case study in excess and poor decision-making. But the story doesn't end with his assassination. No, Elagabalus leaves a legacy of scandal so rich and strange that it continues to baffle historians and fringe theorists alike. Imagine the palace, its high ceilings echoing with dissonant laughter, the clinking of goblets filled with exotic wine, and the occasional low growl of an animal far too large for such a setting. Elagabalus, untroubled by the conventions of Roman dignity, throws banquet after banquet where his eccentricities are on full display. At one such event, he is said to have released a swarm of snakes into the banquet hall to amuse, terrify his guests. Did he do this to assert dominance? Was it a display of divine power, considering his religious fervor for the Eastern sun god? Or was it simply a juvenile prank from an emperor with no sense of political nuance? Historians remain divided. Some suggest these stories were exaggerated by Roman elites desperate to discredit him posthumously, transforming scandal into an elaborate myth. Fringe historians argue that these accounts, recorded by sources hostile to his rule, actually paint a distorted picture, ignoring his administrative reforms and effective governance. The emperor's downfall was as theatrical as his reign. The Praetorian Guard, tired of endless disruptions and fearful for their own safety, stormed the palace one fateful night. Elagabalus was dragged from his chambers, not with the noble dignity of a fallen emperor, but amid shouts, jeers, and perhaps even a few relieved chuckles from those who had long considered him a circus act masquerading as a ruler. It's a scene not of political intrigue, but of exasperation. His death becomes a cautionary tale not just of overreach, but of how eccentricity can rapidly spiral into oblivion when combined with absolute power. The fall of Elagabalus is as much about personal taste as it is about political stability. One of history's strangest monarchs meets the simplest of ends, stabbed to death in a palace that had once been a temple of imperial absurdity. From there you drift toward the reign of King Charles II of Spain, a ruler whose life and death are drenched in scandal and medical mystery. Charles II, the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, ruled during a time of decline, his health as frail as the empire itself. His body was famously afflicted by severe deformities, which historians still debate were due to generations of inbreeding, resulting in what some call the Habsburg jaw and other genetic maladies. What stands out most is not just the physical aspect of his suffering, but the deeply embarrassing nature of his death. Decades of poor health and bad medical advice culminated in a seemingly inevitable downfall. Reports suggest that Charles II suffered repeated digestive ailments throughout his reign, treated by physicians who often recommended bizarre remedies involving animal parts, herbal concoctions, and occasionally, outright superstition. The official cause of death? Rumored to be a combination of digestive complications, a weak heart, and as fringe scholars suggest, possibly arsenic poisoning. This last theory is hotly debated, with some claiming it was political assassination thinly veiled by incompetent medical care, while others insist it was merely the tragic result of centuries of inbreeding and the medical ignorance of the time. In his final days, Charles II's court was rife with whispers of scandal. Nobles jockeyed for power while doctors argued over who should administer the next dose of something undoubtedly ineffective. His death was neither heroic nor dignified. Rather, it was a slow collapse, a morbid comedy of errors where each poorly chosen prescription nudged him closer to the inevitable. One of the most curious fringe theories posits that Charles's doctors had become so convinced of his terminal state that they deliberately avoided effective treatments to hasten his death, hopping to end a political deadlock. Historians remain divided, caught between the narrative of natural decline and political intrigue. But beyond politics and medicine, the tragedy lies in the humiliating banality of it all. No dramatic last words, no heroic final stand. Just a king whose body, like his empire, slowly gave out under the weight of bad choices, bad luck, and possibly bad genes. And so, as you feel yourself drifting further into this soft narrative haze, the peculiar irony emerges ever clearer. In the grand dance of power, the most potent threats often come from the mundane. A poorly cooked meal, a misapplied sunscreen, an eccentric pet policy, or an incompetent physician's recommendation. These are the true agents of royal downfall. Your footsteps pause momentarily, the shadows growing longer as you prepare to delve into yet another bizarre tale of regal indignity, where decadence meets demise and history whispers its most awkward. The corridor stretches on, quieter now, softer, as if each step you take sinks you further into the slow unraveling of history's most embarrassing royal episodes. The faint scent of parchment and aged stone lingers, mixing with the distant hum of uncertainty. The next tale awaits, a story soaked in medieval misadventure, poor choices, and debates that still echo in the halls of scholarly chambers. You arrive at the reign of King John of England, a monarch whose name is synonymous with incompetence. Known largely from the Robin Hood legends and the Magna Carta, King John is often portrayed as the archetypal bad king, a tyrant who lost not just lands but the respect of his people. Yet few realize that his ultimate downfall was as mundane and embarrassing as a poorly chosen apple. It's 1216 and England is in the grip of political turmoil. John has been fighting wars, losing battles, and irritating nobles with his heavy taxes and tyrannical rule. His health is failing, compounded by a series of digestive problems that contemporary chroniclers describe in a mix of sympathy and ridicule. One particularly strange account suggests that John, in a moment of ill judgment, consumed a large quantity of green apples. You're probably thinking, how bad could that be? But in the medieval world, dietary wisdom was hardly a science. Green apples were considered potentially dangerous when unripe, believed to upset the stomach or disrupt the balance of the humors, a theory still hotly debated among medical historians. Whether it was the apples or some underlying infection remains unclear. What is certain is that King John's condition deteriorated rapidly. His body became bloated, feverish, and painfully incapacitated. He reportedly died in the middle of a campaign in a small, damp castle somewhere in eastern England, with no grand announcement, no final declaration of defiance. Instead, he perished with the quiet indignity of a man undone by bad apples. The event has become one of the most overlooked yet fascinating episodes in royal history, precisely because it lacks spectacle. No grand conspiracy, no executioner's blade, just a bad fruit choice that historians still argue over. Some claim the apples were poisoned, others suggest they were merely unripe, leading to fatal digestive complications. The fringe theory proposes that John's death was a covert assassination masked as dietary misfortune, a convenient way to obscure a politically motivated murder. Others, perhaps more grounded, suggest that poor preservation methods and a lack of understanding about food safety were to blame. Either way, the image remains vivid. A king bloated and ill, succumbing not to rebellion or battlefield wounds, but to something as trivial as an apple. This is medieval history at its most ironic. Your thoughts drift next to another grisly yet strangely banal tale, one of decapitated dynasties and disputed final moments. The Romanovs, Russia's last imperial family, offer a chilling example of how royal bloodlines can unravel in public spectacle and historical ambiguity. In 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal servants were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. You likely know the broad strokes. The Russian Revolution overthrew the centuries-old Romanov dynasty, ending with a firing squad in a bleak basement in Yekaterinburg. But the details are murkier and far more embarrassing than official histories suggest. Contemporary witnesses describe the execution as chaotic. The firing squad, poorly coordinated, allegedly failed to deliver a clean kill. Some of the royal family members were only wounded, requiring further shots at close range. Blood reportedly splattered across the walls of the room, mingling with the expressions of horror, fear, and disbelief. What makes this event particularly fascinating and ripe for fringe theories is the sheer incompetence of the execution. Some conspiracy theorists argue that certain family members survived and escaped, spawning legends of Anastasia Romanov and other living royals. These theories, though largely discredited, refuse to die, persistently resurfacing in books, documentaries, and movies. Historians remain divided. Some contend that the execution was a carefully orchestrated political act meant to eliminate the Romanovs as symbols of tyranny. Others argue that it was a mess of unpreparedness, an embarrassing failure of revolutionary discipline leading to unnecessary cruelty and lingering doubt. The Romanovs' execution stands out as a grim reminder that revolutions don't always operate with precision or dignity. The fall of an empire, often romanticized in history books as inevitable and orderly, is more frequently marked by botched operations, miscommunication, and human error. As you proceed further down this gentle spiral of royal misfortune, you begin to notice the quiet rhythm of it all. No heroic last stands, no grand battles. Just a series of small, humiliating errors, each one echoing louder as the decades slip by. A king who dies from bad apples, an emperor poisoned by a suspicious meal, a dynasty executed with a rifle's imperfect aim. These are not the epic sagas you learned in school, but rather the uncomfortable truths historians have chosen to preserve and debate for centuries. And now, as you walk deeper still into the labyrinth of history, your mind is ready for yet another twist, a tale where scandal meets sips of poor judgment and regal legacy collapses into shameful legend. Your footsteps echo softly as you move onward, the shadows thickening like whispered secrets trapped within the walls of forgotten history. You feel the atmosphere slow, the tension softening into a drowsy acceptance that royalty, for all its grandeur, is as vulnerable as the most ordinary of mortals. The next story drifts into the scandalous and surprisingly mundane, an awkward tale of a royal who met his end not in battle or assassination, but by sheer folly. Let's talk about King Henry VII of England, not for his multiple marriages or the religious revolution that split England in two, but for the embarrassing, almost farcical circumstances surrounding his death. You're probably familiar with Henry VII as the larger-than-life monarch with 6 wives and a notorious appetite for power. Yet few focus on his final chapter, a slow and painful collapse into oblivion. It's 1547, and Henry is in his mid-50s, a man whose earlier athletic vigor has long since been replaced by monstrous girth, plagued by chronic leg ulcers and other ailments. His court physicians, likely more intent on maintaining favor than competence, prescribe a concoction of treatment so bizarre it reads like a parody of Renaissance medicine: animal dung poultices, unregulated herbal remedies, and possibly mercury-laced potions. One particularly absurd and poorly documented account suggests that his fatal misstep involved a simple miscalculation, a sudden fall from his litter while being carried around the palace. The event was not an act of political violence, nor an assassination attempt, but rather an accidental tumble caused by his sheer weight and weakened bones. No dramatic battle cries, no final words of wisdom, just an embarrassing and utterly undignified collapse. Scholars still argue about the precise cause of Henry's death. Some maintain that his obesity, compounded by untreated diabetes and chronic wounds, slowly did him in. Others suggest that his reliance on utterly ineffective medical remedies hastened his demise. A fringe theory even speculates that court intrigue played a role, positing that advisors purposefully allowed his health to deteriorate, clearing the path for a more controllable successor. But the most striking part of the story isn't the politics or medical incompetence, it's the sheer unvarnished human failure. A king who once stood as a symbol of power and authority, towering over Europe's political stage, reduced to an infirm man unable to stand, stumble-prone and dependent on a litter and bizarre concoctions. His death wasn't a noble sacrifice for the glory of the nation. It was a slow surrender to bodily decay, negligence, and possibly bad luck. From this quiet embarrassment, your thoughts drift to the reign of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, a tragic figure whose downfall is a curious mixture of political naivety and bad timing. Installed by French intervention in 1864, Maximilian's rule was doomed from the start. His luxurious tastes and European arrogance collided disastrously with the political realities of Mexico, where local conservatives and liberals alike viewed him as an imposed foreign ruler. The peculiar part of Maximilian's downfall lies not in grand battles or fierce uprisings, but in the way he handled his own execution. After being captured by Mexican forces, he was offered a chance to renounce his claim and live in exile. Yet in a move both puzzling and emblematic of his hubris, Maximilian refused. Some historians argue he believed stepping down would betray his sense of duty or royal honor. Fringe theories suggest he overestimated his own charisma, convinced that his European background would eventually save him. Maximilian's execution was anything but orderly. Rather than the gallant end of a dethroned emperor, it became an awkward spectacle of mismanagement. The firing squad, perhaps inexperienced or ill-prepared, took multiple attempts before his body finally succumbed. The event was far from dignified. A young European prince, dressed in fine military attire, shot repeatedly in a firing line more reminiscent of a farcical tableau than a somber state execution. Some scholars still argue whether Maximilian's choice to face execution rather than exile was an act of tragic stubbornness or utter cluelessness. The fringe perspective claims that his death was less political martyrdom and more the result of sheer misjudgment and an underestimation of his captors. What stands out in these tales is the same theme you've been following: the collapse of power into absurdity. Monarchs, emperors, and kings who once wielded armies and empires undone by trivial human error, poor choices, or simply bad luck. Henry VII's fall from his litter, Maximilian's mismanaged firing squad, King John's fatal apples. They're not failures of epic proportions, but quiet, pathetic resignations to fate. As your journey continues, you feel the soft hum of inevitability drawing you forward toward the next strange chapter, a story where royal grandeur meets digestive misadventure and a kingdom's last embarrassing. The ancient walls around you seem to breathe softly, as if exhaling the faint whispers of scandal and folly that cling to every corner of history. The dim light flickers and your footsteps slow further, easing you into the quiet rhythm of historical embarrassment. The next tale winds through the tangled web of royal ambition, stomach ailments, and the peculiar intersection of pride and digestive collapse. Let's turn now to King Charles VI of France, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. His reign is remembered less for battles won or treaties signed, and more for an increasingly disturbing mental decline that culminated in one of the most bizarre episodes of royal dysfunction in history. Charles VI, often called Charles the Mad, wasn't merely a victim of unfortunate genetics or political intrigue. His story stands out because of the sheer peculiarity of his illness and the impact it had on his rule. In 1392, during a military campaign, Charles reportedly suffered a violent episode of mental instability. He suddenly attacked his own knights, convinced they were plotting against him, leading to a horrific scene where he wounded several before being restrained. Historians still argue whether this was due to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or perhaps some strange combination of medieval medical misdiagnosis. The mainstream historical consensus leans toward a hereditary mental illness exacerbated by immense stress, poor medical practices, and inadequate understanding of psychological care. But what makes Charles VI's reign most awkwardly fascinating is how his bouts of insanity began to define state governance itself. For months at a time, Charles would descend into periods where he didn't recognize his own children or subjects, sometimes speaking in gibberish or parading naked through the halls of Versailles. There's a curious, almost comical tale that during one such episode, he believed he was made of glass and feared shattering if he moved too vigorously. Imagine the royal court scrambling to maintain appearances, nobles exchanging sidelong glances while trying desperately to conceal the king's fragile state from foreign emissaries. This was not the image of majestic power, but a slow unraveling of dignity, layer by layer. Adding another twist, a fringe theory suggests that Charles's madness was politically convenient for certain factions of the court. His incapacity allowed competing nobles to rule in his stead, turning the monarch into a symbolic figurehead, while real power shifted between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated power grab or a tragic byproduct of unfortunate circumstances. Charles VI's death in 1422 was as quiet as his decline had been scandalous. He passed away in a small, dim chamber, reportedly clutching a rosary, the weight of his madness and political incompetence hanging heavily in the air. There were no grand declarations, no battlefield heroics, no posthumous redemption, just a slow fade into irrelevance and whispered ridicule. Your thoughts now drift to King Edward II of England, whose reign is an exquisite study in royal ineptitude and personal scandal. Edward, ascending the throne in 1307, was a ruler whose personal decisions seemed almost calculated to undermine his own authority. His obsession with favorites, Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, sparked outrage among the nobility and destabilized his rule. But it's not just political favoritism that marks Edward's downfall, it's the humiliating manner of his death that earns him a particularly infamous place in history. After being deposed in 1327, Edward was imprisoned, reduced from king to prisoner. His final moments are steeped in whispered scandal and grotesque legend. The most famous and most grotesque account claims that Edward II was murdered in a particularly bizarre way. Some chroniclers assert that a red-hot poker was inserted into his anus, allegedly to avoid outward marks of violence that would sully royal dignity. Other historians dismiss this as medieval sensationalism, a myth perhaps invented by enemies seeking to further shame the fallen monarch. Yet, fringe theories argue that the method of his execution was chosen precisely because it combined pain, secrecy, and ignominy, avoiding a public spectacle while ensuring death. Historians remain divided over whether Edward's death was the result of deliberate murder, sheer incompetence, or an unfortunate medical condition aggravated by neglect. Some argue he may have died of natural causes, exacerbated by poor treatment in captivity, while others suggest deliberate foul play by those who wanted to erase his line. What fascinates you is not just the method, but the clear pattern of human frailty intersecting with royal ambition. Edward's relationships, political missteps, and tragic end reflect a larger theme, that absolute power does not exempt one from human folly. The monarchy's grandeur, built on pomp, lineage, and divine right, crumbles under the weight of personal incompetence, scandalous decisions, and in some cases, digestive mismanagement. As you continue your slow descent, the tale settles around you like a soft, undeniable truth. History does not romanticize failure. Instead, it preserves the awkward, the humiliating, and the utterly ridiculous, because they remind us all that, in the end, no crown is immune to folly. Your next step leads toward another unusual royal exit, this time soaked in political paranoia and medical misadventure. A narrative where ambition, bad advice, and an overabundance of poorly prescribed remedies converge into one last, unforgettable misstep. The dim light of your mental path softens even further, like the slow descent into sleep itself. The faint hum of forgotten whispers seems to settle into a gentle rhythm, punctuated only by the occasional creak of history's uneven steps. You're entering the middle of this peculiar journey, where scandal blends seamlessly with medical mystery, and royal dignity erodes beneath the weight of very human mistakes. Next, your attention turns to the curious case of Queen Joanna I of Naples, a woman whose life and death encapsulate scandal, intrigue, and an ignominious collapse from power. Joanna ruled in the 14th century, a time when female monarchs were still rare and often viewed with suspicion. Her reign was marked by political instability, accusations of adultery, and the fatal consequences of choosing the wrong allies. Joanna's life is as tragic as it is bizarre. She was accused of orchestrating the murder of her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, which immediately embroiled her in scandal. Though historians still argue over whether Joanna ordered the assassination or was simply a political scapegoat, the rumors alone were enough to destabilize her rule. But her downfall wasn't fueled solely by political enemies or scandalous gossip. No, Joanna's end was more peculiar and quietly humiliating. In 1382, she was imprisoned by Charles of Durazzo, a rival claimant to the throne. Her imprisonment was far from the dramatic siege of a fortified castle you might imagine. Instead, it was a rather mundane incarceration, locked away in a small, damp cell. Truly bizarre detail, which historians still debate, is the cause of her death. Some suggest she was strangled under orders. Others, a fringe theory with oddly persistent traction, claim she died of natural causes, possibly a botched medical treatment administered during her captivity. Chroniclers of the time ambiguously described a sudden and inexplicable illness, leading to speculation that she was fed poisoned food or given a fatal dose of some healing concoction that only hastened her demise. Imagine the scene: a queen reduced from regality to prisoner, dying in obscurity, her final breath marked by either deliberate malice or sheer medical incompetence. No grand legacy, no last public words, just a faint whisper in the dusty records of history. Your mind drifts now to another royal misstep, oddly drenched in overconfidence and tragic miscalculation: Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's exile on St. Helena. Napoleon, one of history's most celebrated military geniuses, famously crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, an act dripping with ambition and subtle hubris. But what followed was far less glamorous. After his defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The conditions were harsh, the climate damp, and the food reportedly miserable. You'd expect a military mastermind to die in dignity or strategize an epic escape, but no, his decline was marked by a series of humiliations that read like a tragedy disguised as farce. Napoleon's final years were spent in increasingly poor health, plagued by stomach pain, weight loss, and chronic fatigue. Historians still argue over the exact cause of his death. Was it stomach cancer, arsenic poisoning, or simply the cumulative result of his earlier battles, poor living conditions, and overuse of ineffective treatments? Fringe theories abound. Some claim his entourage deliberately poisoned him to prevent any chance of return. Others insist it was merely the ineptitude of early 19th century medicine, where bloodletting and mercury-based pills were prescribed with reckless abandon. What makes Napoleon's demise uniquely embarrassing is the sheer pettiness of it. The once mighty conqueror of Europe, the man who had redrawn the map of the continent, reduced to a frail figure in exile, obsessing over scraps of paper, dictating memoirs, and nibbling on poor-quality food that may have hastened his death. Imagine the tragic irony. A man who stormed across Europe in military triumph, now fading into obscurity in a damp, wind-swept prison island, his imperial legacy slowly crumbling like a poorly constructed sandcastle. Even more peculiar is the public perception of his death. Rather than being remembered for strategic genius or imperial ambition, Napoleon is often recalled in popular culture for his exile, his bloated frame, and the rumors about his poorly prescribed medications. And so, as your journey continues deeper into the dim corridors of history, you begin to see the gentle pattern emerge of rulers undone not by revolution or assassination alone, but by everyday folly. Poorly chosen meals, bad medical advice, misunderstood mental illness, or political miscalculations. This isn't history written in heroic chapters or bloody battles. No, it's history written in small tragedies, in humbling missteps that remind you of something profoundly human. No crown, no matter how grand, is immune to absurdity. Your next steps lead you toward a story soaked in scandalous rumor and unremarkable failure, a tale where a king's downfall was almost too ridiculous to record. The atmosphere softens even further, the ancient stone beneath your feet seeming to dissolve into memory itself. Your mind drifts half awake as you follow the gentle thread of royal misfortune, winding through scandal, odd accidents, and whispered debates that have lingered for centuries. The next story teeters on the edge of political absurdity and personal humiliation, a quiet, strange episode that history remembers for its sheer awkwardness. This is the story of King Charles XII of Sweden, a monarch whose life was as dramatic as it was tragic, but whose death remains a peculiar mystery wrapped in scandal and conjecture. Charles was a warrior king, leading Sweden during the Great Northern War, fighting battles across Eastern Europe with the unyielding stubbornness of a man convinced of his own destiny. His campaigns were marked by both brilliance and reckless arrogance, military feats that won him fame and blunders that would seal his fate. But it's the circumstances of his death in 1718 that captivate you most, because they are, in a word, embarrassingly mysterious. On the cold winter night of November 30th, Charles was inspecting the siege lines at the fortress of Fredrikstad in Norway. Reports suggest he was in good spirits, perhaps too confident, wandering the front lines with little regard for personal safety. Then, quite suddenly, he was struck by a bullet to the head. The official version claims an enemy bullet ended his life. However, historians still argue fiercely over the possibility that Charles was actually assassinated by his own men, possibly due to growing disillusionment with his leadership. The debate is endless, with no clear evidence pointing decisively in either direction. What makes the story particularly absurd is the sheer randomness of it all. There was no heroic last stand, no final battle to be immortalized in epic verse, just a king, struck by a bullet whose origin remains uncertain, collapsing into the snow like so many before him. The awkwardness of a warrior king felled in such an anticlimactic way fuels fringe theories to this day. One fringe perspective suggests that Charles's personal arrogance made him a target of growing resentment among his officers, and that his death was, in fact, a quiet coup disguised as enemy fire. Others argue that it was purely bad luck, the chaotic fog of war conspiring to deliver a fatal, seemingly trivial shot. The public reaction was equally perplexing. Charles was alternately mourned as a military genius and mocked as a stubborn fool who couldn't recognize the limits of his own ambition. His death became emblematic not of sacrifice, but of a slow slide into irrelevance, punctuated by poor decision-making and persistent hubris. Your thoughts now drift toward another royal figure whose demise was steeped in scandal, mismanagement, and a particularly embarrassing lack of foresight, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, often called the Mad King. Ludwig II is renowned for his extravagant castles, his fascination with Wagnerian opera, and, ultimately, his mysterious death. His life was one of eccentric indulgence and political naivety, marked by grand architectural projects that drained Bavaria's treasury and a disinterest in actual governance. By the late 1880s, Ludwig's erratic behavior had pushed his ministers to declare him insane. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine mental breakdown or a politically convenient declaration designed to remove an inconvenient monarch. The debate continues. Was Ludwig genuinely disconnected from reality, or was he a victim of political intrigue? His death in 1886 is as enigmatic as it is embarrassing. Official reports state that he drowned in Lake Starnberg under mysterious circumstances, supposedly while out for a walk with his psychiatrist. But there was no struggle, no clear explanation. Some fringe theorists claim it was a quiet murder by political adversaries disguised as a tragic accident. Others argue it was a simple misstep, a misjudged path near the water's edge, the poor choice of footwear, or an unnoticed bout of dizziness due to medication. What makes Ludwig's story stand out is the profound ordinariness of it. A king who spent his life building fantastical castles, dreaming of fairy tale grandeur, undone not by revolution or conquest, but by a possibly accidental fall into a lake. His death wasn't marked by dramatic execution or battlefield defeat, but by the soft, almost comical inevitability of personal misfortune. Historians still debate the nature of his end, parsing every ambiguous detail of the coroner's report and every rumor whispered by court insiders. Some insist Ludwig drowned himself in a tragic act of despair. Others point to the suspicious absence of witnesses and suggest foul play, possibly ordered by his political enemies eager to erase a liability. As you continue down this gentle, sleepy path, you realize that the most fascinating part of these royal misadventures isn't the grandeur or the scandal itself, but how each story quietly echoes the others. The same pattern emerges again and again: human error, political miscalculation, medical incompetence, and sometimes sheer bad luck. Next, you're drawn toward a tale where royal excess meets digestive misadventure in a manner so bizarre it could only be true history. A story where a king's appetite sealed his legacy in quiet, embarrassing. The gentle hum of history's whispers grows softer still, as if inviting you further into the peculiar and quietly shameful saga of royal exits. You feel the rhythm slow, the weight of these small tragedies settling in like a soft sigh. It's not grand battles or political revolutions that claim most of these monarchs. It's the ordinary, the mundane, and the downright ridiculous. Your next stop is King George II of Great Britain, notable not for great conquests or brilliant reforms, but for a death that has gone down in history for its sheer awkwardness. You're likely familiar with George II as the last British monarch to lead troops into battle, a relic of an older time, stubbornly clinging to outdated notions of monarchy. Yet his final chapter is remarkable not for its nobility, but for something far more humiliating. In 1760, George II was attending a routine cabinet meeting discussing political affairs with his ministers. Nothing particularly dramatic about that, except that, without warning, he suffered a fatal attack of an aortic dissection. His demise was immediate, happening mid-discussion, without pomp, ceremony, or the faintest hint of dignity. The curious detail that makes this death especially amusing in historical accounts is that George II apparently collapsed while sitting in his chair, mumbling incoherently, his ministers frozen in a mix of horror and awkward indecision. One account even suggests a whisper of "God save the king" drifted faintly from his lips, as if the phrase itself couldn't quite mask the absurdity of dying mid-meeting. Historians still argue whether George's death was entirely natural or exacerbated by the chronic stress and ill health that plagued his later years. Fringe theories suggest that his cabinet rivals might have known of his frailty and simply let the moment unfold without intervention, a passive form of political execution. There's no grand funeral procession, no stoic last words, just a king seated among his ministers, undone by his own body at the most inopportune moment imaginable. It stands out not for political conspiracy or assassination plots, but for a quietly pathetic inevitability. Your mind now drifts to another peculiarity, a story soaked in rumor, scandal, and possibly tragic incompetence: King Alfonso XIII of Spain. He reigned during the early 20th century, a period marked by political unrest, loss of empire, and a growing disconnect between monarchy and people. His rule was riddled with scandals, from dubious political alliances to public allegations of personal debauchery. But it's the nature of his exile and death that earns a place in this growing gallery of absurd royal demises. After the fall of the Spanish monarchy in 1931, Alfonso XIII lived in exile, drifting from country to country. His health deteriorated steadily, and by the time of his death in 1941, he was suffering from chronic ailments, a weakened heart, and digestive troubles. The most bizarre detail: his death was reportedly triggered by what many considered a particularly poorly chosen meal, a heavy, greasy dish served at an otherwise inconspicuous dinner. Some historians still argue whether this was an unfortunate case of indigestion, a politically motivated poisoning, or simply a cruel twist of fate. Fringe theories suggest the meal was deliberately sabotaged by political enemies, hopping to erase a now useless monarch from the public eye without overt violence. What makes Alfonso's end stand out is its mundanity. No dramatic exile speech, no last stand of defiance, just a quiet man far from his throne succumbing to poor medical care and perhaps poor culinary choices. His death was more a sigh than a statement, more an afterthought than a historical milestone. As you drift further, the pattern becomes clearer than ever. These aren't the grand, heroic deaths of kings chronicled in ballads and epic poems. No, they're quiet resignations to fate, marked by incompetence, misadventure, and the humbling fragility of human flesh. Next, you're led toward a tale of ancient misfortune, where a pharaoh's legacy crumbles not under the weight of invaders or conspiracies, but due to a most unexpected source, a simple wardrobe malfunction. The ancient air thickens as you press onward, the slow cadence of your journey into royal ignominy blending into the background hum of history's quiet failures. The faint crackle of old records and dusty parchments seems to soften, as if the walls themselves are trying to lull you further into this series of unfortunate events. The next story tiptoes into scandal, intrigue, and the messy world of courtly politics, where the line between power and humiliation blurs and history's judgment becomes as murky as ever. This is the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose life was drenched in drama from birth to death. Her reign was never without controversy, but it's her final moments that truly stick out as a peculiar blend of scandal, political calculation, and public spectacle. By the time you reach 1587, Mary had been imprisoned in England for nearly 2 decades, a pawn in the dangerous game of Anglo-Scottish English politics. Queen Elizabeth I of England viewed Mary as a significant threat, a Catholic figurehead who could rally discontented nobles and Catholic plots against Elizabeth's Protestant reign. Historians still argue whether Mary's imprisonment was a strategic political move or a grave injustice. Fringe theories suggest that Elizabeth personally ordered Mary's death because she envied her cousin's greater claim to the English throne, while others argue that Elizabeth was pressured into the decision by a parliament eager to rid itself of a destabilizing rival. What makes Mary's execution particularly noteworthy is just the act itself, but the awkward sequence of events that led up to it. On February 8, 1587, Mary was led to the execution block in a cold, dim chamber of Fotheringhay Castle. She was reportedly dressed in mourning black, composed but visibly trembling, fully aware that her death would echo through the corridors of history. The awkwardness begins with her final words, a speech far longer and more dignified than one might expect, full of carefully chosen phrases that seem to veer between resignation and self-pity. She reportedly declared her innocence, lamented her fate, and cursed those who conspired against her. The words were as much a political statement as a personal farewell, intended to shape how posterity would remember her. Then came the execution itself, which by all accounts was poorly coordinated. The executioner, reportedly inexperienced or perhaps just overwhelmed by the occasion, missed the first blow. A second, weaker stroke followed before a third and final swing completed the job. The scene was far from dignified. Instead of a swift, noble end, it was a disjointed, awkward spectacle, replete with murmured regrets and barely stifled snickers. Some fringe theories argue that the executioner intentionally botched the job as a personal protest against the act of regicide. Others suggest it was simply a result of poor technique, inadequate preparation, or equipment failure. Historians remain divided, parsing each detail for signs of deliberate sabotage or sheer incompetence. What stands out most, though, isn't the politics or possible conspiracies, it's the way the event turned into a public embarrassment for all involved. Mary's death was neither heroic nor tragic in the classical sense. It was messy, awkward, and far from the dignified martyrdom that would later be claimed by some of her supporters. Your thoughts drift now toward another infamous case of regal downfall, the curious story of King Louis XVI of France. Unlike grand revolutions that unfold with dramatic bloodshed and heroic martyrdom, Louis's end is soaked in indecision, ineffectual leadership, and the quiet humiliation of a monarch unable to adapt to the changing tide of history. By 1793, France was gripped by revolution, the monarchy crumbling under the weight of economic strife, political mismanagement, and widespread public unrest. Louis was arrested, tried, and found guilty of high treason by the National Convention. His sentence was death by guillotine. But what makes Louis's execution peculiarly embarrassing is not the act itself, it was the anticipation, the lead-up, the faint absurdity of the scene. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the scaffold. Witnesses describe him as composed, even resigned, but also faintly awkward. His final words, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," seemed to linger in the air not as a profound declaration, but more as a rather out-of-place protest in a world that had long ceased to care. There was no fanfare, no tearful farewell from courtiers. Instead, the execution unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a bureaucratic process, overseen by those who saw it as nothing more than a necessary administrative task. The guillotine's blade descended, and the king's head was severed cleanly, but the sense of tragic dignity was replaced by the mundane efficiency of a revolution that devoured its own. Some fringe historians still argue whether Louis's trial was fair, a politically motivated sham, or a legitimate reckoning of a tyrannical reign. Others suggest the entire spectacle was designed to humiliate, turning the once mighty monarch into a public example of failure. What captivates you most in this thread of royal embarrassment isn't power lost in rebellion, but power lost to the utterly mundane. A clumsy trial, a poorly coordinated execution, a monarch who couldn't even die with grace. As you drift further, the faint echo of past follies guides you toward a story where music, politics, and royal ambition combine into a final, awkward performance, a tale so strange it teeters between farce and... The atmosphere settles even softer now, like the gentle hush before sleep takes hold, your steps slow and deliberate as you follow history's most awkward turns. The walls around you seem to hold their breath, as if unwilling to repeat the tales of folly that have already unraveled. But one more awaits, a story so peculiar that it blends music, politics, and the most bizarre royal downfall into a single, strangely compelling narrative. This is the tale of Prince Louis of Orleans, a French royal whose death was entangled in scandal, personal rivalry, and the odd intersection of aristocratic vanity and political intrigue. You might think of princes as noble, composed figures, navigating the treacherous waters of court politics with grace and poise. Louis, however, was none of these things. Louis was known for his love of the arts, particularly music. He fancied himself a patron of composers, a man with an ear for melody, and a mind convinced of his own cultural superiority. Yet behind the refined veneer lay a personality riddled with arrogance and clumsy decision-making. The peculiar story begins with an extravagant musical dispute. In the early 15th century, tensions flared between Louis and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, over influence in the royal court. The argument reportedly began with a slight insult regarding a poorly performed lute recital, Louis allegedly mocking John's musical taste in front of court. You're probably thinking a lute argument escalated to royal tragedy, but that's exactly what happened. Historians still argue whether the insult was a pretext or a genuine personal grudge. Fringe theories suggest that John, known for his ruthless ambition, used the incident as an excuse to eliminate his rival. Others contend it was a spontaneous outburst of aristocratic vanity gone terribly wrong. The confrontation escalated into a meeting that turned violent. John's men ambushed Louis in the streets of Paris, reportedly stabbing him multiple times in an assassination that was as embarrassing as it was brutal. The act was neither subtle nor elegantly executed. Eyewitness accounts describe a clumsy melee, with bystanders gawking in confusion, nobles trying to maintain composure, and Louis himself reportedly protesting his attackers with little effect. What's especially fascinating is the symbolic nature of the act. It was less about political gain and more about personal rivalry, a petty quarrel over musical taste ending in bloodshed. The sheer absurdity of a royal's downfall being precipitated by a lute-related insult has long made this story a favorite among historians who prefer the bizarre to the grand. Some fringe historians even suggest that the entire incident was orchestrated to shift public perception, turning Louis from a frivolous aristocrat into a tragic martyr, conveniently sidestepping the more unsavory political motivations behind his death. Louis's demise became a quiet scandal. His body lay unattended for hours, a grim testament to the chaotic, poorly managed politics of the time. No dignified procession followed, no solemn eulogies praised his patronage of the arts. Instead, the event faded into whispers, an embarrassing footnote in the annals of royal misfortune. Your thoughts now drift toward another curious chapter of history, steeped in digestive mystery and political intrigue, a story where royal gas trouble becomes the final, quietly humiliating act in a monarchy. The weight of history's muted missteps seems to press in ever more softly, like the slow dimming of a fading candle. You continue, half entranced, half drowsy, carried by the rhythm of unremarkable blunders and quiet tragedies, stepping further into the strange and humbling world of royal downfall. The next tale is peculiar indeed, a curious intersection of digestive misadventure, political consequence, and public spectacle. Let's talk about King Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose reign and demise read like a tragic satire of royal incompetence. Charles II ruled in the late 17th century, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a lineage plagued by generations of inbreeding, medical misfortune, and steadily dwindling political power. You might already know that Charles II suffered from a multitude of physical and mental ailments. His appearance was often described as grotesque by contemporary observers, weak, misshapen, and frail. He was plagued by chronic digestive problems, frequent convulsions, and a general inability to rule effectively. Historians still argue whether Charles's condition was purely genetic, stemming from extreme consanguinity, or whether his poor health was exacerbated by the primitive medical practices of the time. A fringe theory even suggests that his strange physical deformities and digestive woes were deliberately exaggerated by political rivals seeking to undermine the Habsburg legacy. But what makes Charles II's death uniquely embarrassing is the manner in which it unfolded. In 1700, Charles died at the age of 39, reportedly suffering from a final catastrophic digestive collapse. Accounts from the time speak of a slow, agonizing decline, bloating, relentless pain, feverish delirium. There's a particular anecdote recounted by contemporary chroniclers and whispered in the corridors of European courts that Charles's last meal was poorly prepared, heavy with fatty meats and dubious sauces, poorly digested and possibly tainted. Some fringe theories claim the meal was poisoned, intended to hasten the end of the Habsburg line and clear the way for a Bourbon succession. Others suggest it was a case of sheer mismanagement, an emperor whose physicians, armed with little more than superstition and bad advice, prescribed more food and wine to restore balance, thereby accelerating the inevitable. Historians still argue whether the digestive collapse was a natural consequence of his congenital illnesses or a result of utter medical incompetence. Either way, Charles II's death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but a final embarrassment for the Spanish crown, a monarch undone by the very organs that should sustain life. The aftereffects were politically monumental yet embarrassingly mundane. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, redrawing Europe's political map, but the cause of Charles's death remained mired in rumor and quiet speculation. His body was embalmed poorly, causing further indignity, and his passing became less a solemn occasion and more a whispered cautionary tale about hereditary folly. Your next step carries you toward yet another chapter where political paranoia and personal ineptitude intersect in one final, ridiculous act. A tale of a king undone not by a battlefield defeat or court conspiracy, but by an absurd overestimation. The slow cadence of your journey carries you forward, as though time itself is beginning to blur, blending fact and legend into a soft, drowsy haze. The distant echo of scandal and awkward demise seems to lull you into a strange comfort, as you step further into the peculiar tapestry of royal misadventures. The next tale is an exquisite example of political paranoia colliding spectacularly with personal ineptitude, ending in a quietly absurd yet tragic way. Let's turn now to the curious case of Tsar Peter III of Russia, one of the shortest reigning monarchs in Russian history, and an embarrassment of both incompetence and poor political judgment. Peter III ascended to the Russian throne in January of 1762, only to be deposed a mere 6 months later. His reign is often dismissed as inconsequential, but the circumstances of his downfall and death are remarkable in their sheer awkwardness. Peter III was a German prince by birth, more interested in Enlightenment philosophy, military reforms, and even adopting Prussian military styles than the traditional autocratic rule expected of a Russian czar. His subjects and court courtiers viewed him with suspicion and derision. His unpopular policies included a sudden withdrawal from the 7 Years' War, seen as a humiliating capitulation by many. Historians still argue whether Peter's abdication was a matter of political inevitability or the result of a poorly orchestrated palace coup. Fringe theories suggest that his wife, Catherine the Great, masterminded the entire affair, seeing an opportunity to seize power under the guise of saving Russia from her inept husband. Others maintain that Peter's incompetence made him a convenient scapegoat, ripe for removal. But the truly embarrassing detail lies in his demise. After his forced abdication, Peter was imprisoned in Ropsha Palace. Rather than being executed outright or exiled with dignity, he was left in what contemporaries described as humiliating captivity, deprived of dignity, and exposed to political gamesmanship. The strangest and most debated aspect is that Peter died mysteriously only a few weeks later. Official records claim he died of natural causes, but fringe theories abound. Some whisper that he was murdered under Catherine's orders, strangled by an overzealous jailer, or left to die from untreated illness. Others argue that it was a tragically accidental death, a botched medical procedure, a forgotten infection, or sheer neglect. What makes Peter III's downfall particularly absurd is not the political intrigue itself, but the manner in which he was discarded. A man who had held the title of Tsar, whose image once graced palaces and official documents, quietly removed from history like a worn-out piece of furniture. His death became a scandal wrapped in silence. Catherine the Great ascended the throne, ushering in a golden age of enlightened despotism, but Peter's legacy was buried beneath layers of denial, rumors, and a general reluctance to acknowledge his brief and inept reign. The official narrative treated it as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the empire, but whispers of foul play continued to circulate in salons and dusty archives. Your thoughts now drift toward another curious royal chapter, where the intersection of vanity, pride, and poor health culminated in a particularly undignified royal end. A story where the obsession with appearances quite literally became a king's undoing. The gentle pulse of history slows even further, like the distant ticking of a clock fading into the silence of the night. You're halfway through this peculiar odyssey, each step sinking deeper into the soft, muffled hum of royal failure and quiet ignominy. The next tale weaves vanity, intrigue, and mysterious illness into a story that still divides historians and continues to stir whispers among scholars. Let's talk about Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only woman to officially rule as emperor in Chinese history. Wu's ascent to power was a combination of political savvy, ruthless ambition, and clever manipulation of court intrigue. Her reign during the Tang dynasty was both unprecedented and controversial, with historians still arguing whether her rule was enlightened or tyrannical. But it's the mystery surrounding her death that remains particularly bizarre and quietly humiliating. Wu Zetian ruled for decades, celebrated and vilified in roughly equal measure. Her political acumen was undeniable. She strengthened the central government, supported the arts, and opened government positions to talented commoners. Yet the shadow of palace intrigue always loomed large over her rule, especially regarding the fate of her rivals and children. When Wu died in 705 AD, the official record claimed natural causes, a peaceful passing after a long and effective reign. But fringe theories suggest something far more scandalous. Some whispers suggest that her death was hastened by palace conspirators, perhaps poisoned, perhaps simply neglected to allow her health to deteriorate more quickly. Other fringe narratives allege she may have been undone by an ill-advised attempt at self-medication, a common but tragically ineffective practice in ancient China. One particularly strange rumor claims that Wu had been experimenting with exotic herbal remedies, some thought to grant immortality, but which instead accelerated her physical decline. Historians still argue whether Wu's end was a quiet retreat into natural decay or a politically convenient removal masked as an accident. What makes this tale stick in the mind is not the sheer power she wielded, nor the grand reforms she enacted, but the quiet mystery of her death, a subtle scandal that never quite leaves the shadow of doubt. It is said that in her final moments, Wu remained composed, issuing orders to ensure a smooth succession, leaving no room for public spectacle or dramatic martyrdom. Her burial was elaborate, befitting an emperor, but the lack of clarity around her demise only fueled further rumors. What lingers in the air is that same humbling pattern that's threaded through every story you've encountered so far. Human error, unchecked ambition, poor medical advice, and perhaps sheer bad luck. Your next step takes you toward a chapter of etiquette and protocol gone catastrophically wrong, a case where royal decorum itself became the cause of a king's final humiliation. The hush of history drifts around you like a slowly descending fog, your steps measured and sleepy as the stories grow softer, more peculiar, and quietly tragic. Every narrative so far has unwound with the same gentle inevitability. Rulers undone by human folly, medical misadventure, and political blunders that were far from glorious. Now your path takes a turn toward etiquette, protocol, and an embarrassing final misstep that became legend. Let's turn now to King Edward V of England, one of the infamous princes in the Tower. His brief and tragic reign is already steeped in political scandal, but it's the manner of his disappearance and presumed death that stands out as a perfect example of royal ignominy. Edward V was only 12 years old when he ascended the throne in 1483, following the death of his father, Edward IV. His reign lasted less than 3 months and he never saw a formal coronation. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, ostensibly to guide the young king's rule until he came of age. Historians still argue whether Edward V was quietly deposed in a coup or whether he vanished due to the cold political calculations of his uncle, who later assumed the crown as Richard III. The standard historical narrative suggests that Edward and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were confined to the Tower of London and then mysteriously disappeared, presumed murdered. What makes this case particularly bizarre and oddly embarrassing is the sheer ambiguity surrounding their fate. Some fringe theories suggest they were killed on Richard III's orders, while others point to Henry Tudor supporters, eager to blame Richard for the deaths as part of a political smear campaign. A particularly outlandish fringe theory holds that the princes survived, lived out quiet lives in obscurity, and were never murdered at all. Yet no concrete evidence ever surfaces. Your imagination stumbles now over the absurdity of the official account. Two young royal children imprisoned in the heart of power, fatting away in silence, leaving no trace except whispered rumors and questionable chronicles. The idea of their disappearance isn't dramatic in the heroic sense, it's more akin to the tragic loss of two innocents caught in a ruthless game far beyond their understanding. The embarrassment of this chapter lies in the absence of ceremony, fanfare, or justice. There was no grand trial, no public reckoning, no decisive act of vengeance. Instead, history leaves only shadows and speculation, as though even the chroniclers found the whole affair too awkward to record clearly. Your next steps lead you toward a final story soaked in political paranoia and personal vanity, a tale where a king's health deteriorated not due to war, scandal, or conspiracy, but because of a fatal obsession. Soft hum of history's disjointed footsteps carries you forward, each word settling like a feather landing in the quiet recesses of your mind. The pattern becomes unmistakably clear now. Procession of royal failures woven not through the drama of epic wars, but through far less glamorous causes, vanity, poor judgment, and absurd accidents. The next tale is a particularly strange instance of a king undone not by political intrigue or battlefield blunder, but by his own misplaced priorities. This is the curious case of King Gustav III of Sweden, a monarch whose death is as peculiar as his reign was extravagant. Gustav III ruled during the late 18th century, a time of Enlightenment ideals clashing awkwardly with old-fashioned royal pomp. He fancied himself a patron of the arts, a man of refined taste, a philosopher king of sorts. Yet beneath the elegant facade lay a man prone to vanity, reckless political ambition, and poor personal decisions. His death was neither a result of revolution nor assassination driven by high-stakes political calculus, but was instead the result of a failed, oddly trivial assassination attempt that would spiral into tragic incompetence. On March 16, 1792, during a masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, a setting dripping with pageantry and ostentatious elegance, Gustav III was shot in the back by a member of a conspiracy seeking to curb his autocratic rule. The assassination itself was in many accounts clumsily executed. The assassin, disguised in a theatrical mask, managed to fire a single shot that wounded the king but failed to kill him outright. Now here's the embarrassing part. Despite having been shot, Gustav III continued to attend the ball for some time, refusing to believe his wound was life-threatening. His vanity seemed to suggest that no political assassin could bring him down so easily. He lingered in high spirits, trying to maintain the impression of regal invulnerability even as the blood quietly spread. Medical care in the 18th century was notoriously ineffective, but Gustav's case was especially tragic. His doctors, either incompetent or too deferential, failed to extract the bullet or properly treat the wound. Instead, they applied poultices and ineffective remedies, leading to a slow, agonizing infection. Historians still argue whether the infection was inevitable or a result of gross medical negligence. Fringe theories suggest that some conspirators deliberately provided poor medical advice, ensuring the king would die painfully while avoiding the direct political responsibility of murder. For 13 long days, Gustav III suffered. His death was marked not by a noble last stand or a dramatic public execution, but by a drawn-out descent into sickness and weakness, all while he maintained the posture of unshakable royal pride. He died surrounded by courtiers, who awkwardly praised his courage and dignity even as the body visibly deteriorated. What makes this episode particularly noteworthy is the quiet farce of it all. A king who refused to acknowledge his mortal wound, doctors who seemed to have no clue what they were doing, and a public narrative carefully managed to frame the event as a tragic martyrdom rather than an embarrassing medical failure. And now, as you drift toward the final stretch of this somnolent journey, you're drawn toward one last story, a peculiar coup attempt that ended not in triumph but in spectacular failure and embarrassment. A political mess so absurd it remains a puzzle. The soft, muffled cadence of history's peculiar tragedies leads you to the final stretch. The last tale before your journey through royal embarrassment drifts into the gentle hum of sleep. By now, the rhythm is familiar, power undone by folly, vanity, incompetence, and sometimes sheer bad luck. The last story, perhaps the most peculiar of all, intertwines political miscalculation, clumsy execution, and an almost laughable public humiliation. This is the tale of King George IV of the United Kingdom, a monarch whose reign from 1820 to 1830 was marked less by grandeur and more by scandal, indulgence, and extraordinary personal misjudgments. Known for his extravagant lifestyle, over-the-top fashion, and insatiable appetite for pleasure, George IV's legacy is often remembered as a catalogue of excess and quiet incompetence. But it is the story of his final days that stands out. George IV suffered from a series of chronic health problems, many related to obesity, gout, and lifestyle-induced ailments. His personal vanity and preoccupation with appearances, soaked in silks, jewels, and excessive ceremonial attire, made even simple medical care a challenge. Physicians, cautious or intimidated by his royal temper, often deferred to his whims rather than offering effective treatment. Historians still argue whether his ultimate demise was a natural culmination of chronic illness or exacerbated by the relentless indulgence and poor advice of those around him. A particularly quirky detail involves the king's final weeks. George reportedly refused certain treatments because they would interfere with his elaborate ceremonial wardrobe, insisting on dressing in full regalia for audiences even as his health deteriorated. Fringe theories suggest that this stubborn attachment to pomp accelerated his decline, a kind of vanity-induced mortality that only a monarch could manage. On June 26, 1830, George IV passed away quietly at Windsor Castle. Unlike the dramatic, heroic deaths of legendary kings, his passing was largely unnoticed outside the court, a subdued event lacking any real public spectacle. There were no cries of victory, no tragic last words to immortalize him in history, only the soft acknowledgement that yet another king had been undone by ordinary, all-too-human failings. What makes George IV's story particularly amusing is the dissonance between perception and reality. He spent a lifetime orchestrating his image to impress, to command respect, to craft an air of dignity and majesty. Yet in the end, he was remembered more for his indulgence, eccentricities, and quiet incompetence than any military or political achievement. The irony of a king obsessed with presentation being undone by health and poor decision-making is a fitting conclusion to this procession of awkward royal exits. And so, as your journey through these curious tales comes to a close, the pattern is unmistakable. Power offers no immunity from folly, no shelter from miscalculation, and no escape from the quiet absurdities that follow every human life, especially those crowned with pomp and title. You've walked through history's corridors of embarrassment, past kings who died mid-meeting, queens whose executions were botched, and monarchs undone by vanity, digestive misadventures, and plain bad luck. Each story whispers the same reminder: even the most exalted can fall, quietly, awkwardly, and sometimes ridiculously, leaving a legacy defined not by grandeur but by humbling human fragility. Now, as the final echoes of misfortune fade, your mind begins to ease into a gentle, untroubled state. Let the stories settle like soft dust over the memories of these monarchs, each misstep a small, peculiar comfort that the trappings of power do not exempt anyone from the unpredictability of life. You feel the weight of the day lift as you drift further into calm, your imagination no longer following kings and queens, but resting in the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. The hum of history softens, the tales of folly and failure fading into the gentle whisper of night. Let the absurdities, the quiet embarrassments, and the improbable endings of these rulers settle into a distant memory. You are safe, unburdened, and carried by the soft cadence of the past as it folds into the present. Sleep approaches like a warm, steady tide, and the echo of history's awkwardness slowly dissolves, leaving only the comforting hush of your own.